Hey guys, Quiv the Lazy Geek, welcome back to the channel, and today I am going to look back at my 14 years of astrophotography journey and look in particular at the telescopes that I've used, because in astrophotography, of course, one of the main elements in our system is the optical element, the telescope whose role it is to gather the light, gather the photons from our target and focus them on a camera sensor. And I've used quite a few over the years, and a lot of those telescopes that I've used are still available for purchase. And so I wanted to do the retrospective effectively. So I am going to do a purely subjective ranking, which might be very different for other people, even for the same telescope, simply because I'm looking at both the telescope that I was using, our OTA for optical tube assembly, which is really like the optical and mechanical part of the telescope, and the conditions that I was using it in, the camera I was using it with, my skill level at the time, and also the mount that I was using it with. Because if you have a terrible mount with a great OTA, the OTA will appear terrible simply because the mount isn't tracking well, and the OTA will not be given a chance to shine. So let's go through this. And here we have our tier list, and on the right hand side I've put up all chronologically from top to bottom and then back up all of the OTAs and optical tube assemblies that I've been using across the years. Well, not all of them. Some of them I didn't use long enough, or they're not super relevant for the discussion, so I've removed them from there. But otherwise, most of the ones that I used for a fairly large amount of time, I've put in here. And you'll notice probably a trend across my progression in astrophotography, a trend of going for low focal lengths, meaning telescopes that don't zoom in a lot, so tracking issues is more forgiving, and then sometimes like desiring to go with a longer focal length to zoom in onto the targets. And then after a while, I go back to lower focal lengths. And because I'm an idiot, I keep like switching back and forth rather than just having two separate setups that can do long focal lengths and short focal lengths. And I also have regularly some astro slumps where I get depressed with the hobby and I just sell all of my equipment except like a couple of scopes, which is what happened to me like a year ago or so. Anyway, let's start at the top with my very first really good astrophotography optical tube assembly, which was a small refractor, 70 millimeters diameter. It's called the Blanca 70ED, and it is sold in Japan by Kasai Trading. I believe it is a rebrand of Chinese optics made by DSO, but I am not completely sure. This telescope was a doublet, meaning it had two lenses at the front, effectively, and those two lenses had their job of focusing the light down the sensor. Doublet telescopes, they can be very, very good, but sometimes they're not enough to really take care of how different wavelengths of light, so blue light and red light, for example, will focus at slightly different points of the focal plane, meaning that if you focus for the red light, then the blue light will be out of focus and vice versa, and that can basically trigger things like chromatic aberration. But honestly, that was like at the very start of my journey, and at the time I really didn't care. I was using this tiny telescope, you can see it's like 30 centimeters long, together with a Smart EQ Pro mount from Ioptron, so very low capacity kind of mount. And I was also using a camera called the Meade DSi3 color camera. That's a really old one. And honestly, the whole setup worked really, really well. It was a very smooth experience with a really good focuser. The dovetail was far too short, but I didn't care and it kind of worked, and I didn't know better at the time. There was an integrated lens hood. It was a really nice, really neat little telescope that was f6 by default, and with a reducer, I think it was around f5. It was honestly a great way to start. And this is one of the images that I took with the telescope. This is my first really decent astrophotography where I could actually see the details of a nebula here, M27, the Dumbbell Nebula. And this is an old photo, so I don't have the raw data anymore or anything like that. But we could see the structure. I had gotten details. The terrible tracking is visible. And we can also see, as I expected, like chromatic aberration around the edges of stars, which is completely 100% expected. But overall, not a bad result. Even in the corners, the stars appear perfectly fine. So combined with the reducer that I was using, this is perfectly fine. It was a perfectly decent piece of equipment, and I really, really enjoyed it. That said, chromatic aberration, it's a doublet scope, so kind of like a beginner scope, but at the same time, it was kind of cheap. At the time, it has gotten more expensive with inflation. Overall, no complaints. At the time, it was a perfect budget starter scope. Although these days, if I had to buy a starter scope over again, I would go with like maybe the Sharpstar 61 EDPH2, but we'll get to that one later. For now, this one, perfectly good. I'm hesitating between A and B. I'm going to put B simply because of like the optical, not defects, but the optical limitations of the telescope, and also like the things like the dovetail being too short, that kind of thing. And the next one that I have, and you'll notice very quickly that this is my attempt at going for higher focal length because I wanted to take pictures of things like galaxies or details of nebulae, and it was the AL107-PH. This is from Sharpstar. I bought this one used, and it was truly a thing of beauty. And I used it with my ZEQ25 mount, whose equivalent these days is the Ioptron SEM26, I believe. And on my rooftop balcony, with a lot of wind, honestly, the mount didn't quite cut it. So I had trouble taking images with it. It was otherwise a really good telescope. And what I remember the most is that because it was such a big telescope, far bigger than I expected, it came with a massive field flattener and focal reducer that was like, I think, 2.5-inch format. The mechanics of the focuser was butter smooth. And this one was a triplet telescope, which really means that it has 3 lenses at the front, which typically helps avoid chromatic aberration and focus all of the visual spectrum colors to the same point on the sensor. And it worked, it achieved its target fairly well, although at the time I was basically not experienced enough to take full advantage of that scope. I think I should have stayed a bit longer with the Blanca 70 ED, which was that doublet with the ED glass in it. And this is one of the results that I got. Again, this was M27, and we can see a lot more details within. I do not remember which camera I was using with this. I do believe it was a monochrome Canon 550D camera with the Bayer matrix on top of the sensor actually scratched off. But like tons of details. It's the same target as before, M27, but yeah, longer focal length, so I got more details. I was very, very happy with that. And the star shapes, it almost looks like I had a little bit of like pinched optics, but I'd say like at the time it was simply too much for me. Too much focal length, too much reach, too heavy for the mount. A bit too difficult to use in wind. I ended up not using it much at all, although it was really, really a beautiful, beautiful little telescope, or actually big telescope. But in the end, it proved to just be too much for me. And I ended up selling it for to go back again. We can see the cycle to lower focal lengths. And so this one, based on my experience at the time, it would basically be a C. It was a beautiful scope, but I couldn't really get anything out of it because of my level. And if I were to use it now, I'm pretty sure it would be an A or maybe even an S. But I am going to rank it based on how much I used it and how I liked it at the time, meaning C, because simply it was not appropriate for me with my mount, with my equipment, with my experience, and with my skills. So I'll put it as C, but remember that if you're experienced in astrophotography or you have better mounts than I do or less wind, then this could very easily be an S tier or an A tier. And then I went back, as I was saying, to lower focal lengths, and I really went to lower focal lengths. I started with a Canon 200mm f2.8 lens. I loved this little lens. It is the Mark I, and I sold it since, but it was an amazing little piece of kit. It worked really, really well, and had a very wide aperture of f2.8, and honestly, with my sensors, it worked amazingly, and I used it mostly with the very first generation of the ZWASI 1600 Cool, which at the time didn't have a USB hub at the back. It had a guide port, an SD4 guide port at the back. And because I was using it with a monochrome camera, I wanted to use it with a filter wheel, but at the time ZW didn't make any filter wheels. There was no choices, and because of the very small back focus distance or flange distance of Canon lenses, which I believe is 44 millimeters, as I remember it, there was no filter wheel on the market that would actually fit between the Canon lens and the ZW camera and also reach focus at infinity. So it was really tough, but I got, as you see on the picture, a filter wheel to work. I do not remember the brand of that filter wheel. I bought it used, and it supported 2-inch filters, and it was controlled via USB, as I remember it. And I remember getting adapters as required. So I got a Canon EOS bayonet mount adapter from Telescope Service that was 9 millimeters thick and really, really, really thin. And then I got the filter wheel, and I got adapters for the filter wheel so they could support T-threads on both ends, except that the adapters were raised compared to the actual filter wheel kind of surface there. And so I actually took a grinder and I ground down the adapters. I had no idea what I was doing, but after doing that, I was actually able to reach focus. And you know what? I'm not sure, obviously, but I think I'm probably one of the first in the world, if not the first, to be using the 1600 Cool camera together with a Canon lens and a filter wheel. And over the years with the lens, I pimped it up. I added the ZW filter wheel. I added like a micro focuser. Later on, I actually added an Astromechanics adapter, which we can see on this picture here, where we have the adapter controlled via USB, and that actually provides power to the lens, so that I was able to control the focus of the lens directly from the adapter via an ASCOM driver. Obviously, I'll put, by the way, all of the links down in the description, including to the Astromechanics adapter. This was really a game changer to using Canon lenses in astrophotography. Like, it mounts really tightly against the bayonet of the lens, so there's almost no sag, and it used very little back focus, so it was great to use the Astromechanics adapter, monochrome camera, and filter wheel, ZW filter wheel. It worked beautifully all together. This is one of the first pictures that I took with the 200mm lens. It is the area, the narrowband area around Cedar. I believe at the time it was Optolong narrowband filters, SHO. Those filters were terrible, by the way. You can see at the edges, yeah, the stars are no longer perfect. I had some tilt, and it's not perfect, but I was imaging at f2.8, right? And for me, like the Canon lens represented a really good compromise between like ease of use, low focal lengths, can be driven by any mount out there, and it worked beautifully. Perfect compromise for someone like me. The only problem was the flange distance of 44 millimeters with the bayonet mount that made it a bit difficult to use. And so because of this, I'll put the Canon 200mm as the A tier, not S tier, because it is not quite perfect. But then I also wanted to have higher focal lengths again, and not that much higher, but a bit more reach. And so I bought a lens that was heavily promoted by Astro Shops in Japan, which was the Kowa Prominar 500mm f5.6 lens. And this lens is no longer made, so it's no longer available, which is a shame. It's a fluorite lens. And it had like a 2-stage focuser, like a rough focus here at the back, and towards the front, like finer focus. And it also had some amazing features. The bayonet mount that it used was very low tolerances, so it was extremely tight. There was almost no sag, And it also had a reducer available that made it into a 350 millimeter f4 lens, which at the time was absolutely amazing. I loved this lens. I used it with my 1600 Cool quite a lot at the time, and I took some of my best pictures with this lens. And fully decked out, this is how the lens looked like. I had even put, as you can see, an off-axis guider on it, had my filter wheel, I had my ZW camera, I had a moonlight focuser for the lens, I had like a double kind of ring plus dovetail on it. It was amazing. It worked so well. And those are samples of the pictures that I took with this lens, and the ZW 1600 Cool camera. And yeah, I mean, I loved this lens. Maybe not quite perfect in the corners, but honestly, look at this. I mean, honestly, this is just good. It was just good. I honestly, like, I think it's probably like it was the perfect lens once fully decked out. It was perfect for my skill level. It took great pictures. It was easy to handle. It just worked. The only issue was when I first received the lens, the star shapes were terrible and I had to return it. And the second lens that came, the bayonet mount had an issue, so I had to return that one as well. But once that was done, the third sample I got was absolutely amazing. Really awesome lens. I'm an idiot for ever selling it. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. And so this lens gets an S tier. This is probably the biggest regret that I have, is to sell this lens, especially since it can't be bought anymore, except used if you find it. But people would be crazy to sell this lens, honestly. And the next entry that I have in my list is the Samyang 135mm f2 lens, also known as the Rokinon 135mm f2 lens. And I remember seeing on cloudy nights people praising this lens as an astrograph, as like one of the best things they had ever used. It's amazing, etc., etc. And so I just had to get one. And this is how it looks, all decked out. I had taken the lens, I had taken my AZ GTI mount with it. I had a G-optic adapter for the lens that could be tightened very well around the bayonet of the lens. Even so, I had an adjustable Velcro band at the front to really keep the tilt and the sag of the lens to a minimum, so there was a constant angle. And with the G-optic adapter, I was also able to mount a guide scope at the top. And this was used, I believe at the time, this was my 294 MC Pro camera, which I had a love-hate relationship with. Honestly, this was an amazing setup. The picture you see was taken on the volcanic island of Oshima, south of Tokyo, although technically part of Tokyo. And it was very easy to just bring in a backpack, and I was able to take some frames of raw Ophiuchi at the time with this lens, except that it got fogged up like almost immediately after just like 5 minutes. But otherwise, like, because it was so fast, I was actually able to get a decent image with just 5 minutes of exposure time in what is roughly a Bartle 4 zone. And this is what my image of just like 5 minutes of exposure time on raw Ophiuchi looked like. Like, how amazing is that? I mean, obviously it's very noisy. We can see all of the noise, but like, look at it from far away, and it's amazing. And the stars were quite sharp. And I remember actually speaking with a Patreon supporter recently about how I remember the stars as not being sharp with this lens, but that's actually not the case. It worked. It was really an amazing little lens. And this is another picture that I took. This was from the mountains of Okutama, west of Tokyo. And this is a place where I was rudely interrupted by a security guard after just 30 minutes of imaging, and I had to run away. Well, not run away, but kindly explain what I was doing and run away. But at the time, I was not using the G-optic lens adapter that could really tighten against the lens to avoid sag. And you can see the issue with the lens, which is that in the corners, very easily, you could get tilt, and that f2 tilt really doesn't forgive anything, and you can see the stars will get a bit weird at the corners. But otherwise, like, for 30 minutes of data from a place that is technically in Tokyo, even though it's like more roughly border 5 to bottle 4, that was an absolutely amazing result for me. Like a banger little lens. And I would say like the only issue that I had with the lens was that it could not be controlled via USB, right? Whereas my Canon lens, in the end, I was able to add the ASCOM Astromechanics controller, and I was able to just power the lens via that controller and make the focuser or even the aperture ring move as required. This was not possible with the Samyang, and at f2 it means that I had to refocus throughout the night, which is not lazy enough for me. Right now, if I had the lens, I would be able to buy so many adapters or even 3D print adapters myself. So I could just fit an EF, a ZW EF focuser on the lens and just use it as a fully automated setup. Makes me want to buy it again. I really should not be doing those videos. Amazing little lens, honestly. There are bad samples out there. I've heard of bad samples, and I thought I had a bad sample for a while. But this will go, at the time, for me, A tier, because I could not automate it. If I were to use it today, it probably would be S tier. So A tier in here for this little lens there. Now, the next one that I have in the list is my Celestron EdgeHD800 telescope. It had a focal length of 2000 millimeters, or when I reduced it to f7, which is what I was using it, like it was then 1500 millimeters. So you can see, again, I overcorrected going from low focal length to I want more reach, and 1500 millimeter focal length, completely unrealistic. Even with great mounts from my balcony that receives a lot of wind, it just didn't make sense. And there's another reason why this did not make sense whatsoever for me, was the seeing in Tokyo most of the time is terrible. The upper atmosphere has a constant agitation wind that goes through. The whole Tokyo Plains is a channel for wind. The atmosphere is, with the exception of a couple of nights a year, always in movement, in motion. The seeing is always terrible. And so I was oversampling with the EdgeHD telescope, completely oversampled. It was wasted equipment on me. And I had geared it up with the focal reducer, so it was f7. I had added a moonlight reducer on it. I had managed to make the Celestron off-axis guider actually fit together with the moonlight focuser, sorry. And I used it a lot still with my 1600mm cool camera. And yeah, it just wasn't for me. This is one of the images that I got with it, the Pelican Nebula. I mean, the stars are fine, the details are cool, but you can see I don't get as much details as I would hope for, simply because of the poor seeing in my location. This was really a telescope that was wasted on me and my conditions and my equipment. And so it's an amazing telescope. It can be decked out really well, but for even now, I wouldn't be able to use it. So for me personally, this goes into the D tier. But for a lot of other people, this would easily be an A or an S tier. Although there are some issues. There are some mirror locks at the back that are supposed to stabilize the primary mirror, but you could not use them when you were focusing via the primary mirror. So I had to use the moonlight focuser. Yeah, there were some, like, probably would be an A or B for most people. For me, in my conditions, it was a D, but that's completely my fault and no fault of Celestron whatsoever. Now, after this experience, I realized, like, I'm oversampling. This is terrible. And so I decided, I had my other cycle of let's go down to lower focal length. Yes, I'm an idiot. Don't tell me I am an idiot. I mean, yeah, go and tell me in the comments, whatever. And so I went with another Canon lens, since I had had good experience with lenses in general and the 200mm Canon lens as well, which is the Canon 300mm f2.8 lens. So this is the old version. I had the old version, the one without image stabilization, and it was a cracking little lens, but it had issues. So here you can see it on my balcony. In the background, we have my EdgeHD telescope that I was still using at the time, and this is very shortly before I sold it. You can see the moonlight focuser, which was amazing, by the way. The Celestron off-axis guider with, it was a QHY camera there, and my ZW camera, it was a beaut. Anyway, we're on this lens here, and this lens I was using it with the astromechanics adapter, so I can control the focus directly of the lens. And I was using it together with my 200mm lens. So I had like the 071 MC Pro camera on my 300mm lens, and then I had the ASI 183mm Pro camera on the right hand side. I had a multi-narrowband filter on the left, and I had H alpha, and oxygen 3 on the right. And so they had more or less the same field of view in the end, and I was able to combine both results together to basically get twice the imaging time, and both with really good focal ratios. And I was stopping down the focal ratio of the Canon lens to roughly f3.2, and also the both the other Canon lens, the black Canon lens, to also around f3.2. Just seeing this setup, it was an amazing setup, and I'm an idiot for ever selling it. But yeah, it was really, really good. And this is one of the images that I got with this setup of the North America and Pelican Nebula. And you can see I was using the not step down rings, but the actual aperture blades of the lens. So I get this. And one of the things that is somewhat visible, maybe I had closed it enough in this particular image, but in some places you can see some weird chromatic aberration. Actually, at f3.2 and below f3.2, there was some kind of like hairs. Like the stars had a weird shape, blue shape going up. So there was a weird chromatic aberration going on with the 300mm lens. And here I might have stopped it down to 4.0 to kind of remove that issue. But it was really a shame that I had to stop down the lens so much with narrowband to get good stars out of it. So I was a bit disappointed by the lens personally, but it was like a 25-year-old lens, right? So it's I bought it used. So meh, it's like probably good. And I know that other people have had issues with the lens, the Canon lens at with the IS, with the image stabilization, because the IS module would actually near the zenith, near the meridian, kind of shift around, which caused issues with star trailing. There is a telescope array called the Dragonfly that I believe uses the 300mm f2.8 or maybe f4 lenses, but they actually went in, and as far as I know, they taped the IS modules down so they couldn't move. Although this wouldn't happen with the astromechanics adapter, since it provides power to the lens, and the lens would be able to keep the IS module from moving. Now, because of the optical kind of limitations of this lens, I almost felt like I should have bought like the f4 lens if I had to stop it that much. I'll put it as a B. Overall, really good, but not as good as I was expecting. And as usual with Canon lenses, there can be like quite a bit of equipment lottery between lenses. And for the last 3 telescopes left, my longtime viewers are probably familiar with all of them. And the next one that I got was the Vixen R200SS Newtonian telescope. And it was a very special Newtonian telescope because it had a focal length of 800mm with a focal ratio of 4, f4, which was really, really good. And together with a chroma corrector by Vixen called the pH corrector, the focal ratio went down to 3.8, f3.8, and the focal length 760mm. It was an amazing scope. I loved this thing. It worked really, really well, although it was not without issues. You can see it here fully decked out, and one of the issues immediately becomes apparent. There's this kind of weird butt cover here at the back, and also kind of a weird cover for the focuser here, and this is because the telescope had light leaks from the back end and from the focuser as well. Without that, I was not able to get good flat frames, and my lights also had defaults, and at first I was like, okay, it's kind of workable. I was able to make it work, but it was far from ideal. The focuser of the telescope, the one that comes with the telescope, is also terrible. In the US, this telescope is provided with a 2-speed focuser, which is honestly absolutely required. In Japan, it's not. It's provided with a single-speed focuser. And but in the end, I used it with the ZW-EAF, which worked perfectly fine for this telescope. And for me, this telescope, once fully decked out, as you see on the picture, was the perfect scope. It had just the right amount of focal length. It had a really good focal ratio as well. It had good optics. It provided good results. It was easy to deal with. Honestly, amazing, amazing scope. And it didn't need collimation. So collimation is not needed on this scope because of the spider vane design. And if you look at it from this point of view, the spider vanes are actually super thick. And this is so that the secondary mirror will not shift. So you don't need to collimate. Nothing needs to be done. And for quite a long time, I didn't need to collimate it. In the end, I had Vixen do a cleaning of the mirror and recollimation. It cost me something like 40 bucks to have them do it, but that's because I'm in Japan. It's probably would be more difficult outside of Japan, but I absolutely loved this telescope. It was the best. And I got some of my favorite pictures with it, like here, Leo's triplet. This is from Tokyo. And this one, I don't remember, M106. And the stars are beautiful. The stars are nice across the field. This was with the 533 MC Pro, one of my all-time favorite cameras as well. And the Sunflower Galaxy, I mean, and the Wizard Nebula, I believe this was with the 1600 Cool. And I mean, this was such a good telescope once you added the focuser cover and the butt plug. And so, like, honestly, I should put it as an A rank because of the initial issues with it has with light leaks and the focuser not being the best. But because I have such good results with it once fully decked out and those trouble kind of taken care of, I'm going to put it as S tier together with the Kowa. Yeah, they're both amazing, amazing telescopes that I regret selling. At least the R200SS, I can still buy it if I want to go back to it. And along with my R200SS, I wanted a fully automated scope that had some reach, but not too much either. And the perfect candidate for that was the 61ED-PH2 telescope. And it's a telescope that came with a reducer to make it an f4.5 telescope with a focal length of 275 millimeters. And honestly, I was hoping it would be a replacement to the Kowa scope. And in a lot of ways, it succeeded. It had an easier way of doing autofocus because the ZWEAF just fit on it. It was, let's say, it's very easy as for a beginner to get a handle on this scope. And you can see it here as I was using it on this channel. Honestly, a cracking scope overall. The ring around the scope is pretty bad. The dovetail that came with it is far too short. You can see I changed the dovetail. And also there was the lens gate issue where I discovered that the telescope had really bad chromatic aberration once I used it broadband, and I had basically Sharpstar actually took care of that. They replaced my objective lenses, and they also allowed anyone to replace their objective lenses. I'm really proud of the work that I did on that, as I really helped the community really replace any defective objective lenses of the telescope. And I got some cracking pictures with it, like the Butterfly Nebula, the Elephant Trunk Nebula, the Heart Nebula, all of those. I loved using it with dual band filters. It was an amazing little scope overall once it was fully decked out. Although it had this lens issue, the accessories that came with it, like the ring bands and the dovetail, were not the best. But overall, this is probably still the perfect telescope for a beginner, but it doesn't come close to my Kowa. My Kowa lens was just amazing. More reach at 350 millimeters focal length and better focal ratio and better star shapes. Oh man, I missed this lens. So this little dude there, it goes as an A. Really good. Okay, I'm gonna... You know what? At the time, because of the issue that I had with the objective lens, I'll put it as a B. But right now, especially for beginners, this telescope is really much an A, even an S. It's an amazing beginner scope, or even for experienced astrophotographers. It's great. I'll just put it as a B for its limitations and the fact that there was this lens issue. And now we go finally to my Hyperstar C6 telescope, which is really two things, which is a C6 telescope from Celestron, which is small and light with 150 millimeters aperture, together with a Hyperstar lens on its front that makes the whole thing f2 focal ratio, which is amazing. Super fast focal ratio, which is really great for Tokyo. And I took this kind of image with it, right? This is the Pleiades from Tokyo, taken with both the 533 MC Pro and the Rising Cam IMX571 camera. This is from Tokyo. The stars are not bad, right? But this is for small field of view, right? The 533 MT Pro sensor was the smallest common denominator. And on a larger field of view, there are weaknesses in terms of the star shapes, which I've also already detailed on the channel. The collimation is difficult when you need collimation. If you're really sensitive to star shapes in the corner of APS-C size sensors, this is not the telescope for you. For me, though, it's perfectly fine. I don't care enough about star shapes. Now, is it a good setup for beginners? Now, that I don't know. Because of the difficulty of collimation, it might be a bit difficult for beginners. But if you're living in a light polluted city, it's really, really good for broadband imaging because it's so fast. And I also can't wait to retake it in dark zones and use it at dark sites. Hopefully together with the AM5 once the weather here recovers. Yeah, I love it. It's really good, but I don't think I can put it at the same level as the Kowa or the R200SS at this time. It's amazing, but one of the other disadvantages with this scope is that for narrowband, you really need to use fast focal ratio narrowband filters because of bandpass shift. And that's a bit of a pain in the neck to deal with. You have to buy specific filters, that kind of thing. Overall, if you gave me the choice between the C6 Hyperstar, which is 300 millimeters focal length and f2, and the Kowa 350 millimeters f3.5 right now, I think I would still go with the Kowa. I love the C6 Hyperstar, but I have such fond memories of this thing when it's fully docked out. Still, in terms of the stuff that you can buy right now, the C6 Hyperstar is really towards the top. And this is the result. This is my result for me for when I was using these scopes in my own progression at my skill level at the time with the equipment I owned at the time. I hope this blast into the past with these OTAs, these telescopes that I've owned across the years has been interesting for you, and looking at the pros and cons of each has been interesting. Maybe it helps you with your next astrophotography purchase. That would be amazing. And I really hope that this video has helped you. If it has, please consider going down below, putting a like, subscribing to the channel, leaving a comment with what you think about those telescopes or what you are using. And all of these, it really helps the YouTube algorithm feature my channel more. It helped me out a lot. And of course, if you want to help me even more, you could always join my Patreon. Thank you so much to my Patreon supporters, or the channel. Same thing for the channel members. To help me financially. This really, really makes the channel possible. And I really can't thank you guys enough. Everyone, thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget whenever you can to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.